Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on the show. What's the difference between education and indoctrination? Is our education system broken, or is it operating as intended? The public school conveyor belt is a relic of the Prussian military model, designed to produce compliant workers for factories rather than sovereign thinkers with upward mobility. We're left with a blindly obedient population that's smart enough to follow orders, but not smart or courageous enough to question the status quo. The masses are conditioned to become habitually compliant conformists, forever reliant on external authority. As Seth Godin writes, to efficiently run a school, amplify fear, and destroy passion. These days, educators have limited intellectual freedom to teach what they want to teach. In past decades, we had far less access to information or schooling, yet we're far more educated. Now, in the age of AI, we have access to unlimited information, but we don't know if any of it is real or true. So what is the future of education? Our guest today is Matt Beaudreau, a former public school educator and administrator who has dedicated his career to rethinking the very foundations of our education system. Matt shares, "When I saw this system for what it was, I could no longer be a part of perpetuating it." As founder of the Apogee Strong Mentorship Program, Matt has an unwavering commitment to empowering young people to become sovereign, self-directed learners, a radical departure from the compliance-driven model that dominates most of our schools. True education should foster creativity and critical thinking, allowing individuals to pursue their unique passions. Matt's belief, which I share, is that genius is common, and true learning is about unlocking the innate genius in every one of us. In this episode, you'll discover how to unshackle your mind from the limits of traditional schooling and cultural conditioning imposed by traditional education, why traditional schooling is anti-entrepreneurial and trains students to be employees rather than innovators, how to utilize passion as a vehicle to learn how to cultivate courage, foster civil discourse, and intellectual flexibility to counter the polarization and echo chambers in today's society, and much more. Let's go hang out with Matt. All right, welcome back, folks. Today we're here with Matt Beaudreau, a former public school educator and administrator who went on to create the Apogee Strong Mentorship Program. Matt is host of the Essential 11 podcast, a 2-times featured TEDx speaker, and a keynote speaker with clients ranging from Lockheed Martin, the United States Air Force, Caterpillar, and Honeywell. Thanks so much for joining us on the show, Matt.
Honor is absolutely mine, brother. Like we said before we jumped in, any friend of Michael O is a friend of mine, and we got a lot of mutual friends, so it's great to connect in person.
That's right. I'm stoked for this one. So why don't we start, for people who aren't familiar with your work, let's start with how your trajectory changed as an educator, because every one of us has kind of a moment where you have to make a serious decision, and yours not only affected your life, but the lives of many people downstream of that. So I'm really glad you made the choice you did.
True, so as am I, man, and I appreciate that. And I'll tell you, and this sounds like I'm about to give you a 3-hour preamble, but I'm not. I promise. I tell people my story in education started when I was 4, and I'm not going to bring you through 4 to now 44. But at 4, I was in kindergarten, and I'm a November baby, so I was there, and I realized it was a game. I remember very clearly being put into the red group for reading, and I remember looking around the classroom, going, oh, "Okay, well, they're grouping us by how well we can read. That group over there needs the most help. Those guys can't read. They can read a little better. They read a little better, and this is the best reading group. So, okay, interesting. There's a game." And then at 8, I went, "Oh, I get this game completely. I'll always get straight A's." And that's pertinent to this whole thing. I'm not that smart, but I recognize patterns. Right, I recognize patterns in the game of schooling, and so I got my straight A's all through. But I came out of high school and went, "I don't know who I am. I don't know what I have to offer the world. I guess I'll go to college," where I got my straight A's again. I got better at sports and girls, the things that actually mattered to me. Right, but graduated and went, "Shoot, man, I still don't know who I am or what I have to offer the world." So I started seeing that pattern playing out. I ended up through working odd jobs. I ended up at Stanford University for a number of years. And I started seeing the same thing with those young people. They were so smart, brilliant humans, but life was hard for them. Relationships were hard. Communication was hard. They had no idea where they were going, what they were going to do. They were feeling the weight of this pressure. They were really good at school, but life was crushing them. So again, that game came back to me, and I'm like, okay, well, this is part of the problem is schooling and life are not the same games. And so again, naively, that's where the journey ended up going. Naively, I'm like, well, I'll go fix it from the inside. And so public school teacher, public school administrator, going, oh, this isn't about kids at all. This is a game about money and power and politics. Naively, I'll go private. Private looks the same as public. Just people pay for it. Same pig, different shade of lipstick. But I had my own kids at that point. And so my own kids, as they started to go in, I came to this crossroads reading up, John Taylor Gatto and so many masters who had come before me. I read their stuff and I went, well, one, I can't look myself in the mirror. There's no integrity here because I believe what I'm doing is actually not helpful to humans at all. So I can't look at myself in the mirror and continue to do that. More importantly, I've got my own kids. They're about to go into this system. I've got to do something different. So I either have to just figure out how we're going to home educate. I have to build something, somewhere in between. And that's when I decided to build, man. And that really is what kicked off the journey of what we're doing here.
Amazing. So yeah, we've been training hoop jumpers for a long time now, but our public education system, and I love the way that you frame this, a lot of people think of it as broken or underperforming relative to other countries. You have a different take on that.
Yeah, it's working perfectly. That's what I want people to understand. And again, I always make the caveat. I want people to get. There's great people working in your government schools or your private schools that look like government schools. I just call them conveyor belt programs. There's great humans working there. There are great humans sending their kids there. My problem is never against the great human, but the system itself was designed for obedience. The system itself was designed to build what you said, hoop jumpers, right? It's just an exercise in being habitually compliant and an exercise in saying, look, somebody else is always going to be the expert of my life. So I just need to look to everybody else to tell me what to do and who to be. That's what it is essentially built for. And so if that's the case, we're not talking about an education, we're talking about indoctrination. It's doing its job really, really well. And I don't believe there is a fixing it, quote unquote, from the inside. And again, there's a multifaceted thing going on here, but no, I think it's working as designed.
And what is that job that it's doing exactly?
It's creating compliant, obedient humans. That's really what it is. It's creating a population that's a widget, that's a cog in a wheel, that really doesn't go to what I believe education should be for, and that's sovereignty. It doesn't show you how to be a sovereign human being. Again, Seth Godin asked me, what should education be for? And he asked me that when I was years into education. And I'm like, man, nobody's actually ever asked me that question. All right. He asked me that. And I went, shoot. And I thought about it. And I said, ultimately, that's what it should be. It should be for sovereignty. It should be, if I'm helping to educate Abel, I lean into what Socrates says. You can't actually teach anybody anything. You can only make them think. So if I'm going to try to educate Abel, I'm going to try to set up an environment to where Abel grows to be the best possible version of himself, not according to me, according to Abel. So anything I put around him has to be an environment conducive to let him grow in the way he's designed to grow. G.K. Chesterton said education has nothing to do with subjects. It is the transfer of a way of life. So I'm setting up an environment, and then any resources, by the way, that means people too, any people that I'm bringing around Abel, I've got to be able to give a nod, and Abel has to be able to give a nod saying, look, their way of life is allowed to be transferred into me too. And that's the process, right? And it's a never ending process. And ultimately, Abel gets to take ownership of that and go, this is who I want to be. This is how I want to do life. This is who I want to do it with. These are the skills I want to continue to acquire, right? And so my job is to help facilitate that. Schooling is the opposite of everything I just said. It is the religious belief, right? That Abel and Matt, you're exactly the same. You're going to do the exact same thing at the exact same time. And if one of you does it better, we might call you ahead. If one of you does it worse, we might call you behind. And everybody has, we don't do that with anything else. If I went to all the families in the country and said, hey, all of your kids have to take the same medication, and you have to take it at the exact same time, all of you. People are like, whoa, 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 let me take a look at what this medication, but we don't question it with school. It's the religion of schooling that's got us wrapped around, but it's the opposite of sovereignty.
But if you dial back the clock a little bit, or you turn back the clock rather, when some of us who were in our 40s, 50s, 60s went to school, it was a bit different back then. It wasn't perfect, of course, but things have changed and not necessarily in a good way.
Sure. The culture has changed, and there's a couple things that have changed. The culture at large has changed. Obviously, the world continues to change. Nobody's going to make the argument that 2024, from the resources, the opportunities, from cultural landscape, that it looks the same as it did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? So things have changed. Um, Schooling itself has also changed a little. The design is the same, but what you had were the nuances of a little bit of individual liberty and intellectual freedom from the people that were teaching within that system too. Right? They didn't have a mass funding based on standardized testing. We didn't have as many of the issues as we see now from a cultural perspective of fatherless homes. Some of the loss of values that we're seeing now, and the loss of man. Like, there were certain things that just helped make that matter, and society actually functioned somewhat in a way of where there was a transfer of knowledge that was taking place at that institution that really wasn't going to come from other places. We didn't, there wasn't there obviously was no internet. There were jobs that did require knowledge that was being passed on in schooling institutions. So yeah, there was more utility in it. It was more pragmatic then. But the further we've gotten away from that, the less pragmatic it has gotten. And the more we've doubled down, the less intellectual freedom our teachers have. Right? The more we're not using the resources, we're not paying attention to how the world is changing. And that lack of adaptability is really allowing the system to crush humanity. That's where we are now.
Yeah. And I've heard you talk about this a little bit, and I love this way of thinking about it. You separate people from the pack because they score well, right? They get 100 and other kids get 78. So that kid's a genius and this other kid's not. Um, but within us, before you're broken or before you're crushed by the system, there exists some level of genius, maybe not in the exact thing that someone else is good at, but in your own thing, or based around your own passion that can grow and separate you from the pack. Our traditional school system crushes that and makes it seem like it doesn't exist, and then makes you feel bad because you have nothing, right?
Right. That's exactly right. It's this very narrow definition. John Taylor Gatto, I mentioned him earlier. If people who are listening have not read his stuff, I highly recommend anybody goes back, read any of the books that he threw out there. He was a New York State Teacher of the Year for 30 years, so he knows the system inside and out, but he's the foremost historian for why, schooling looks the way that it does. And one of the things that he said was genius. I've come to the conclusion that genius is as common as dirt. And in my 2 decades working with human beings, man, I can tell you, I tend to agree. There's a factory setting there of just this brilliance. And I use the analogy of a garden a lot, partially because now in my office, you may have already heard a rooster coming by and saying hi to everybody, but I can see the garden out here. And my wife and kids tend to that garden. And it's not about yelling at the flowers or making all the flowers or the plants or the vegetables do all the same thing as all the rest. It's about the environment. You tend to the soil. We want enough water, not too much water. You want enough sun, not too much sun. You want to make sure the other plants nearby aren't choking out. That's like, you do that, you make sure the environment's good, and that grows exactly as it is supposed to grow. It stays to the factory setting of what that plant is, right? Humans are the same, man. They're the same in that system. They're not the same individuality, but they're the same in terms of that growth cycle. So when we leave that alone and we sit back and we go, okay, here's a little bit of a roadmap, but let's reflect. Let's see what you're doing. What are you excited about? What can you get lost in? What are you inherently curious about? If we really foster that, people do the most brilliant things, and they do it so young.
Is there an
They
example
do it
you
so early. Oh, what kind of
yeah.
example would you I tell people, and I also selfishly almost always start this conversation with my own kids because I'm so flipping proud of them, right? Like, as you and I are speaking right now, my wife's bringing my 13-year-old to work. It's pouring rain out here in North Carolina, but she's going to go out and she's going to work on this ranch for about 2.5 hours right now. And then she's going to go ride some horses, and she's going to teach some other families how to ride horses. So she's going to be out there for the next 8 hours ish right now, right? And so she'll work 30 to 40 hours a week right now. And she absolutely, she absolutely loves it. And her instructor is like, hey, I'll take her before the 18 and 19-year-olds to work out here any day of the week, because she just outworks all of them. She's more mature. So it's that, right? But her love for horses came early. We saw it early. So her priests, so they've never been anywhere that I haven't built, with the exception of she went to a Montessori preschool for a year, right? Her preschool teacher would tell us she doesn't, nothing wrong with her. She doesn't even run though. She gallops, like she right? It's like horses were the thing, man. By the time she was 9 and her sister was 7, they bought their own horses.
Wow.
They bought them. They knew that was a goal. They wanted horses. It's okay, cool. How are we going to do this? So they had 3 businesses by then where they made enough money to purchase horses for cash right from the get-go. Right? Because that was their goal, and they were curious enough about it, and they were excited enough about it to figure it out. So 9 and 7, they're buying horses. We got a young man in our mentorship program who comes from a family, didn't have a ton of money, and wanted to, he's coming up on 16, wanted to get his own vehicle. So one of our challenges was a flip challenge, where you essentially start from a paper clip, and you got to flip your way. No money exchanged. You got to flip your way as far as you can go. Let's see what you can do. Within the first few months, he had his first truck. No money exchanged.
Wow.
Right? His first truck. I can give you these stories for the next 3-4 hours. I could tell you about young ladies who want to speak from the stage but are deathly afraid to talk to anybody. Being at our campuses and being in a Socratic circle, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is so intimidating to me. And then, a year and a half later, she's giving her first TEDx. Brother, I can give you these stories all day long. It's the environment that encourages that and gets them back to the factory settings. It strips away the garbage and the nonsense so that they can be who they're designed to be. We're not doing anything that's magical. We're tapping into how humans are designed.
And this is so critical for people to understand, that when you're young and you're growing, there are these stages of life where you kind of get this one shot to get access to this, whether it's learning a language or falling in love with music or the arts or writing or conversations, entrepreneurship, that sort of thing. If you're just locked into the school, sitting at a desk for 12 plus years, just told to shut up, then how do you ever develop those things? You're going to miss that window. Yet, what you folks do is try to really get kids to act more like we think adults should, right? And for some reason we have this block where it's just like, oh, kids can't do that. That's adult stuff to do, right?
Isn't that crazy, right? Like, how logical is it what you just said, right? And so you're talking about the whole like writing thing. My daughters, my daughters are now 13 and 11, the ones that bought the horses when they were 9 and 7. And because of the brain development, the different stages. If I ask people like, hey, when is the brain fully developed? Most people know it's somewhere around 25, 26. Most people get that, but they don't realize there are these other stages of development too, right? Because school has nothing to do with that. So they don't realize there are these other brain jumps. But people start to get into the ability to be a little more creatively abstract in understanding patterns and understanding how these patterns play somewhere around 12-ish, right? And so my daughter's 13. The one that's 13 has written 2 books since the age of 12, both over 300 pages long,
Amazing.
right? And because we haven't killed the love of it, right? And she sees it as something that is a valuable thing. She doesn't have these self-imposed limitations. We've imposed these limitations on society. Teenager wasn't even a word until 1944. Wasn't even a word. Before then, it was just like, cool, you're moving into adulthood. But the logic of what you just said, if Abel says, I want to be a football player, and I spend 12 years going, okay, you want to be a football player? That sounds great, man. Sounds really good. What we're going to do is by the time you're 5, we're going to put you in this environment. You're not going to really play any football, but we're going to give you all the history of football. We're going to give you the mathematical plays of football. And then you're going to be ready, right? You're never going to touch a football, but you're going to come out and then you're going to be ready. That'd be ridiculous. It'd be even more ridiculous if I said, okay, so you want to play football? Great. We're going to take 12 years. We're going to sit you down. No, you're not going to touch a football, but we're going to teach you everything about basketball because, well, it's a game and it has a ball and there's teams. So like there's some sort of correlation, right? So we're going to get you, decent and competent at basketball and test you on basketball. And then after you do that for 12 years, we're gonna be like, all right, here's your path to go play football. You're gonna be like, okay, but I spent all this time not really playing this other game, but sort of studying this other game. And it wasn't the game that I'm now going to play for the rest of my life. Yeah, that's right. Go play football, do it well. What the hell? Like, it doesn't make any sense. But that's what we do. We go, here, play this game. It's called school. We're going to pretend. We're going to play pretend and pretend that those skills are now going to transfer when you leave here. It's provably ridiculous. And that's why you and I both know people who did really well in school and still did well in spite of, in their life. But we know people who did really well in school and life was a freaking mess. And the reverse is also true. We know people who did not do school well at all, but life has been fantastic, right? They're not the same game.
Yeah, and there are so many games to play. And speaking of that, to use your metaphor, a lot of people think that they might want to play football when in fact their game is basketball, but you don't know that until you actually try it. So that's why the hands-on involvement with this sort of thing is so important.
The ability to find out what you like by trying it is just as important as finding out what you don't like by trying. Right? That's, if you and I go to a buffet and we've never had any of these foods before, the only way to know what we like is to try every one of them. And it's just as important to find out, oh my gosh, this is gross. I don't like this at all. Okay, cool. Sounds good. So then now I'm not going to waste time eating that. I'm not going to waste my space. That's fine. It was valuable to find that out. You're not sitting back on, I wonder. Right. But now you start to see what things you like. And when you really start being able to hone in on the things you like, then you see humans start to get creative too. They're like, "Ooh, okay, I really like tacos, and I also really like Korean barbecue. What if I put those two things together?" Right? Interesting, right? And so people come up with new things and get creative because they're taking all these specific experiences, what Naval Ravikant calls specific knowledge, right? Your experience and your exposure, and you start putting those together and getting creative and putting those patterns together. Yeah, wildly.
What about the concept of enslavement? I've heard you say a few things about that, and of course, some of the authors that you've mentioned also reframe how we can think about this. But let's talk about like intellectual freedom, maybe on one side, and what the opposite of that looks like in our current situation, especially.
Yeah, I I use that word very intentionally, and I know that's a tough word, but ultimately, freedom and sovereignty, I believe, starts and ends in between the ears. Right? It starts there because I have the knowledge and the determination to create a sovereign life for my family. I don't do things with anybody I don't want to do. I am not beholden to anybody. Nobody can come along and take away my business or take away my farm or take away my ability to feed my family or, it's that, right? That's that pursuit. And there's this saying that I love. It's the birds born in a cage think flying is an illness. And what I don't love about the systems of schooling, the medical, I mean, we can make a case for a number of different systems, is that it says there is this one right way, and your habits become akin to thinking that that is the only way that anything happens and moves forward. So you get stuck in this box and it's you see something's wrong, but you get comfortable in that. You get comfortable with a well-defined slavery versus the ambiguity of looking out there and going, yeah, but that bird's just flying around. That bird won't know where to go. That bird won't know where to how to get food. I know I'm going to get fed every single day right here. I know I am comfortable in my enslavement, and that's really what we're doing mentally to our population with schooling. It's the best that I can ascertain.
And you mentioned your garden before. I mean, we we can think of children and people in our community in a similar way, where you don't really want 100 of the same widgets. You don't want just kale in your garden for the ecosystem, for your own nutrition, what have you. You need each different type of thing to fulfill its own role in the ecosystem. And if we let humans do that, we can achieve so much more than just like telling everyone to shut up and giving some people the gold stars and other people the dunce hat, essentially.
It's so simple. It's so simple. That's very well said. It's so simple. It's so obvious. And here's the thing, man. I don't, in my experience, I don't find a lot of people that will disagree with what we're saying. I really don't. But what I find is the vast majority will agree but they're afraid to do something different. That's what I find more often than not, right? You got, I think it's somewhere around 92% of the population that's over 18 has graduated from a conveyor belt program. Mostly, most of that is the government schooling. I don't look around at the population and go, oh my gosh, look at that. I'd say 92% of the population is wildly educated. I don't think many people would. And I can walk people logically through a lot of what we're discussing here. And they'll go, yeah, that makes sense. Yes, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. But it's the emotional attachment to the way they've always thought school is and should be. And that they've got this thing where they say, okay, but I don't know how that was my experience. So I'm assuming that needs to be the experience for my kids. I see that it's wrong, but gosh, man, I just don't. I'm so habitually attached to that I can't leave. And I tell people, if you brought somebody out of a cult, they grew up in that cult for 18 years, and you set them free in the world, and they start to see, oh my gosh, that was not how the world actually works. I've been in this cult. Okay, I need to figure this out. Even if they intellectually understood that, the habits that are ingrained, those patterns, those neural pathways are still going, yeah, but you know how to do this. So it's like, I still want to do cult things, even though I know I'm not in that cult anymore. I still want to do logic doesn't bring people out of the cult. So that's the hardest game right there. Most people understand this intellectually.
What's the deal with school being so anti-entrepreneur? Is it because we're really being trained to be employees and managers and that's all?
That's the ultimate, one of the ultimate components of the design. Again, looking at this from a standpoint of the Prussian military, wanting to raise a population that does not question the government, doesn't question authority, won't produce soldiers on a battlefield that are going, maybe we shouldn't be fighting here, right? Like that was where that came from. And so then you got Rockefeller, who helps bring this over here, spends the equivalent of $1.3 billion, says, I want a nation of workers, not a nation of thinkers. So I'm training them for this factory model because it is going to enrich me. Why would he want other entrepreneurs there to come along and innovate and potentially do something better? You promise them freedom, you promise them safety, you promise them, that you're going to take care of them. And for a time, you actually do. And people are able to build somewhat of a life around that, and they're being taken care of. So why would you, you know, uh, create those innovators? And again, from a human, it's a human management system. So from a human management standpoint, if I've got a 30 young people that are all 11 or 12, and somebody's got a great business idea, well, the way it's designed, I don't have the time. I'm not going to go pour in and help on that, because then what are the other 29 or 30, that are not wanting to do that? What are they going to do? I got to manage their behavior. As you go get your credential, everything is about managing human behaviors. It's not about education. It's how do you manage the human behaviors in the classroom so they all comply and do what you want to do. Here is your guide to where you got to get them to the end of the year. There's where the testing is. There's where the funding is. You don't have time to foster an entrepreneurial spirit.
It was shocking to me. So I grew up in a podunk town in New Hampshire and went to a public school, and then one of my best friends went to kind of a fancy private school for high school, and we couldn't afford that, and that wasn't an option. As much as I wanted to like stay with him and go to that school, but I was able to like cobble to get work hard, get scholarships, and go to another private school that kind of opened it up for me. It was small. There was a lot more opportunity for doing things a little bit differently than public school, and I'm so glad that that happened. But when I got there, it was really interesting because I like sat down in English class, and this actually happened in a couple of classes, and I was so intellectually curious still, and I was asking questions, and I was like fired up and passionate about it, and my teachers and my advisor got together and they're just like, "Oh, this kid doesn't really belong here. He's here to learn. Like this is very
Yeah, it's a
unusual."
problem. Yeah,
And
yeah.
thank goodness, I mean, that they were there. I'm still to this day friends with so many of my teachers at that tiny little public school in New Hampshire, or at that private school in New Hampshire, and they basically spent time trying to create a curriculum for kids like me so that you could nurture those interests. And a lot of mine were around music, recording. I was really afraid of speaking in front of people, very, very shy and introverted. And through music, through the arts, through writing, they kind of brought me out of my shell. And all of this stuff that has happened downstream of that, down the road, podcasting, like creating a new career, all of these just different entrepreneurial ventures. I'm not sure that these would have happened without that sort of treatment early in my life. But even so, uh, and this brings me to this next point that I really want you to talk about. I needed to unlearn a lot, including going to Ivy League schools and getting that sort of education as well. I learned very, very little about the world of entrepreneurship. In fact, I needed to unlearn a lot of the things that I learned there and in the schools before that to really accomplish anything and find my way through it. So maybe you can talk about the importance of unlearning some of the conditioning that we've been subjected to.
I love that, man. The unlearning component, it really is speaking to the ability to adapt. We talked a little bit earlier about how 2024 culturally is obviously vastly different than the 1940s, 1950s. There's so many things that, innovation, you can argue some things are better, some things are worse. That's fine. You can make all those arguments, but we can argue that things are different. So the ability to adapt has everything to do with the ability to acquire new skills when they're needed, has everything to do with being curious enough to ask questions and see where things go and be brave enough to keep pulling that string and go, okay, I'm going to make a new choice. I'm going to make a new decision. I'm going to tackle this new project. All of those things are wildly relevant. But what we don't talk about enough is that you also have to now unlearn what you said, bad habits. We have to unlearn our propensity to want to hold on to the way things have always been. We've all we've got to unlearn that. Like I at some point, and I'm not very technologically savvy, but at some point I had to figure out how this cell phone works. Right? I don't love social media. I don't love tech. I don't love, but you know what I love? I love that you're in Texas. I'm in North Carolina, and you're a rad human that I get to connect with and have a conversation with. I love that.
Yeah, me too.
Like, what, right? How great is that? Like, you and I probably never would have crossed paths if this wasn't so. Like, that's amazing. So I want to learn that, and I want to take advantage of that. Now, I don't know where technology goes, but at some point, it may no longer, like, this iPhone may be like a pager,
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
right?
Hopefully
And so
soon.
there's going to be some other thing, hopefully soon. And so if that's the case, not only do I need to learn the thing that is relevant now that helps me in whatever my pursuit is, helping other human beings, I need to unlearn my attachment to what is no longer relevant. And if I'm not emotionally and mentally flexible in that arena, I'm going to struggle. And unfortunately, that is going to happen. Fortunately or unfortunately, that's going to happen quicker and quicker and quicker than it did in previous generations. And so that ability to unlearn, what we're really speaking about is adaptability. It's that. And again, anything you've done for a long period of time becomes habit, it becomes ingrained, and then it is hard to undo. If you smoke cigarettes for 20 years of your life, that is going to be a hard thing to just break the habit and go, okay, well, I don't smoke anymore. Right now, obviously, there's a physiological thing, but there's physiological, um, you know, uh, things that are attached to what we emotionally do from an educational standpoint. So we're really talking about adaptability, man.
Yeah, adaptability. And sometimes being a very poor student in school can help you there, right? Quick story there. When I was in my mid 20s, I joined this group of entrepreneurs for young men who were doing pretty well in their own businesses and that sort of thing. And we were down at this fancy place in Mexico, sitting down at this dinner with the torches lit and like super fancy, super nice, or whatever. And they're all sitting there, and we're having a great conversation. There are probably a couple dozen of us max, but I was just curious because we were talking about school and people's experience there. And most people shared that they were horrible students or didn't even really go to school. It's kind of like dodged that bullet. Whereas I was a professional hoop jumper, especially not coming from money and wanting to go to the best schools. That meant that I needed to compete with everyone, not just for the grades, but the scholarships and all the rest of this. And so I just kind of like looked around and I'm just like, how many of you all actually graduated from college. And like I raised my hand and maybe three other hands out of like 20, 22 guys there, three other hands go up. And I'm just like, this is really interesting because if you look at like how successful they were in the world of entrepreneurship at a relatively young age in their mid 20s, like wouldn't you think that the people who had studied business in university or even gotten some sort of master's degree there would have some leg up? But that definitely was not the case, and I've kind of had similar experiences in the years since then, and many different examples of that.
That's exactly right, man. I see that all the time. And so shouldn't that point us towards something, right? Because again, the common narrative is the problem is we've been given answers. And we have this religious belief around the answers. The answers are you go to school, you get good grades. Why do you do that? So that you can get into a good college. And then what do you do there? You get into that college, you make sure you go to class and you get good grades. Why? Because that is going to be the thing that leads you to a successful life. What does that mean? Not really sure, but it probably means you're going to get a job right away. People are going to be throwing jobs at you. They're going to be throwing money at you. It didn't matter how much money you took out for loans. You're just going to pay that right back. You're going to be very quick to get that white picket fence around that house. You're going to have your 2.5 kids. You're going to have, right? And so, but we have perpetuated that narrative for so long without paying attention to what the world around us is telling us. It says, well, that doesn't always work out that way. And that doesn't always work out for the best. And people don't want to pay attention to that. They want the common story that we can all just go, okay, and we'll hang our hat on and we'll go from there. Because again, the enslavement part of our brain, that comfort that we seek answers. We want answers. So when we feel like we've got enough people saying the same thing, a lot of times we're comfortable enough going, okay, that must be the answer. I'm good. And what happens when you think you have the answer? You inherently shut off curiosity. That you shut it off. It's all gone because you've already got all the answers. You're not willing to question. Orson Scott Card had a great quote. He says, we question all the things we believe, except for the things we really believe, and those we refuse to question. Right? Because it feels so good to have that answer there and you've got that assurity of where you're going. Even when it's not turning out right, you know that that's the path. You got to be brave enough to ask those questions, man. Because my experience has been wildly the same. We've had 400 entrepreneurs on our podcast, and I have never, one of the questions I used to ask everybody was if you had a young person coming to you right now, 22, 23, and they said, man, I really want to come work for you and with you. What is the one thing you want to see? I can tell you in hundreds of episodes with the most brilliant minds on the planet, none of them said, I want to see a college degree. None of them. And many of them didn't have it themselves, right? I'm not saying it's inherently bad, but let's not pretend that it's some magical unlock either, especially now.
I'm curious about your experience at Stanford. I read a book a few years ago called Excellent Sheep. That do you have it back there? Amazing
Great,
book. That
great.
changed my life when I first came across that. I was like, "Oh no." Maybe you could just share, especially from the world of Stanford, just a little bit about that whole story there.
Yeah, it's essentially there's this whole myth of elite. There's this myth of the elite colleges, and if you go into the elite colleges, things are going to magically work out better. I highly recommend everybody goes in and reads that book. It's phenomenal, and I can tell you again, are there wonderful people at Stanford? Of course. Are there brilliant people at Stanford? Of course, of course. Because guess what? There's wonderful people and brilliant people everywhere. So, okay, cool. Well, I guess we're at like a blank slate now. So now what? Right? One of the problems with these quote unquote elite schools, they actually don't need your tuition. They don't need your money. The endowments are so dang large. And so they are playing a status game. They're not playing an education game. They're playing a status game. Many of the professors are there and they're getting paid to research. They're getting paid to publish. They're getting paid for those things. And so the need or the desire sometimes, and again, do some of the people buck this trend? Of course they do. I'm not making blanket statements, but a lot of them get paid for those things. So the educational component of pouring into those young students is kind of a secondary, tertiary sort of thing, right? If at all. So it's a bigger version of the same thing we're doing on the government schooling side. It's just like come in, play the game, and so you're not really getting an education. Now, can students come in and force that? They can. They can come in and force it and go, no, frick, I don't care. I'm here. I'm going to come in and talk to you in every one of your office hours, and I'm going to make you dive deep, and I'm going to really curate my. Of course, that can happen, but we also aren't raising the majority of our young people in a environment where they're mature in that way because they've gone to conveyor belt schooling that has just said you just play the game, right? And so the whole myth of that elite school thing is real. And at Stanford, I saw much of the same. There was the myth of admissions in general. So there's a game to play. Stanford has to keep up its status of, and this isn't just Stanford; it's the other, you know, all the Ivy Leagues and all this kind of stuff. They have to keep up their status. So U.S. News World Rankings, that report comes out every year of the top universities. Well, the amount of people you accept plays into that. It doesn't matter who deserves to be there based on whatever criteria you're saying. You just have to accept the number so that the percentage. So you want as many applications as you can get. And then you want to only accept a certain amount because if you go over 5%, well, your ranking is going to plummet. Right. So you don't want your ranking to plummet. So you get as many as you can. Stanford will get 40,000 applications in a year. They're not going to go over 5%. But then they're going to start playing the game. This guy's got a 1.7 and he's on parole. Hey, but his dad's a billionaire tech founder. Welcome to Stanford. There's first level of the game. We got future donors. Hell yeah. Welcome to Stanford. Come on in. This guy's got a 2.6 and he's got, dude, have you seen his handles? And the dude can shoot the three. Like, we need a point guard. Welcome to Stanford, right? So you start playing these games that have nothing to do with the meritocracy we've all been told. And then there's the games of, there's the games of race and there's the games of gender and there's the games like all of these things kind of play into this before you get down to the meritocracy of seeing if the person is actually competent and interesting. And then there's these other status, like there's a separate application in a lot of these universities for homeschool kids because that's where they're like, hey, we'll get our interesting kids over here sometimes. And that the application process may be different, right? And the games change all the time every year. There's too many universities playing these status games, unfortunately. I'm not saying university across the board is a bad idea. In fact, we are launching Apogee University. That is and accreditation's not all it's cracked up to be, but ours is accredited through Oxford and Cambridge and but we are getting back to that Oxford model of working directly with a mentor who is working in that field versus the ivory tower academic. And you alluded to this a little bit earlier too, when we were talking about academia. I remember very clear, there was that app Clubhouse.
Yeah.
If you remember that app.
Mm-hmm.
So I got invited to a conversation at one point. It was myself, another guy who was a keynote speaker, David Green, the CEO of Hobby Lobby, whatever the gentleman was, who's the CEO of Coors. And then we had a Yale MBA professor. That Yale MBA professor, and I don't want to put his name out there, but he was very vocal saying, my businesses, the campuses I was building, were not going to be successful from a business standpoint. They weren't going to be sustainable. Didn't matter that they were making 7 and 8 figures and that they're still standing. Like, none of that mattered. My kids were going to be in trouble the way they were being raised. He had all these accusations, and I just remember, can you let me know what businesses you've run? How many businesses have you run? 0. None. But he's got the ivory tower academia answer. He's never actually run a business, but he's going to tell everybody how to run the businesses. How many children do you have? None. I'm not even married. Cool. Sounds good. But you're going to let me know. I was a perfect parent before I had kids too. You bet.
Right.
Yeah. And then I had them and I went, shit, all right, I got to figure some things out. Right. So, that's a long-winded way to say everybody should read that freaking book.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
yeah. So good, man.
and so there are so many blind spots or missing pieces in the education that are becoming more and more obvious as the generations turn over, I think. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the uh, the ability to have an intelligent conversation really isn't that it's not taught, it's not encouraged in any particular way. And so because of that, we have a lot of people who are physically quite mature coming up in the world who can't really have a great conversation, don't really have much interest in it, aren't good listeners. And I know that this is one of the pillars of what you folks teach, and it's one of the most critical life skills to develop. So maybe you can just riff on that a little.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So, we're very big on civil discourse, and there's a couple of things that need to be put back in place for us to be able to do that. And I worked on a film a few years ago with Adam Carolla and Dennis Prager. It's called No Safe Spaces, and I did a couple of live events with Dave Rubin, and we were showing the film, but we were having students come up and having these healthy debates and what that could look like, and we had conversations around civil discourse. And it was so funny. The first event Dave and I did together, we showed up to this small, a liberal arts, small Christian school. They are one of the universities that I actually am a fan of because they focus on real education. The professors are there to pour in. So I have nothing but good things to say about them. But it was interesting because we showed up there for the event. We paid for the space. We were ready to rock and roll. We had people coming. We'd sold tickets. And there was a little bit of pushback at the beginning where they're like, I don't know if we're going to let Dave on campus. I was like, how come? Well, he's a gay Jew. Okay, got it. So we're going to shut down any sort of conversation, even though we've already got this set. We're going to shut down the conversation because there's not alignment on beliefs, right? And here's part of the problem. At the end of the day, my wife and I are probably closest to anybody else in my circle as far as what our beliefs are, but there's still some things we ultimately disagree on. You and I are probably going to agree on 95% of things. We got so many mutual friends. We have a similar background. We're probably going to agree on so dang much. I promise we can get to a point where we find something we don't agree on, right? So what? Does that mean we can't be friends and we can never talk again? Like, that's silly. And everybody knows that's silly, but that's how we're operating. We are so focused on the things we disagree on versus the things we agree on, and then we refuse to have the actual civil discourse and have those conversations. So a couple things need to take place. One, we need to understand that it's okay if we are incorrect on our views. We need to earn the right to have an opinion by being able to argue against our own beliefs better than anybody else. That's critical thinking. We say critical thinking all the time, but critical thinking means you're thinking about your own thinking. This is my view on this, but I need to flesh it out. I need to try to prove a different point of view correct. And all that's I need to look at that evidence, and I need to be brave enough to ask questions, pull the string, and I need to go, okay, that evidence is better. I got to be brave enough to change my mind. Or I go, you know what? I can see where they're saying this, but this still makes more sense. Cool. So you can still hold that opinion, but now you've at least earned the right to have that opinion, right? So we got to do it with ourselves first and be okay with that. And then second, we've got to be okay, emotionally okay to understand other people are going to disagree with that. And engaging with them doesn't need to be this emotional back and forth. I'm going to get my point louder than yours to make sure I win. I'm not having a conversation to win. I'm having a conversation to understand. I want to understand you. So there's rules of engagement in that. I'm not going to get emotionally invested and yell at you. That shuts down conversation. I'm going to be curious and I'm going to ask more questions than I am going to try to give you answers. I'm not going to repeat a bunch of points that I've already made. I'm going to be as concise as I can, right? I'm going to try to stick to the rules of how to engage another human being. And when I can do that, the topic becomes somewhat irrelevant because I can stay in the moment and get an understanding. And I've got to be okay with it. At the end of the day, if Abel presented a better argument to me, I have to go, you know what, man, that you gave me some amazing things to think about. I won't say I've converted to your side, but man, there's some things I need to go get curious about again. And that's cool. And I appreciate that. Right. Like that's it. So it's unpacking all those components. And that's what we're building into our campuses and into our
I
programs.
love that. And not being threatened by these ideas that are different from what you believe or where you came up. I remember the first time that I started traveling internationally, especially to the East, and just kind of talking to people about their lives and what they believed and that whole thing. And it just, I felt completely unmoored in a certain way because their idea of ethics, morality, and so many other things were very different from my own, raised in the Western world around Christianity and Protestant and the work ethic and that whole thing. Talking to some of these people who were wonderful people who had a radically different idea of how humans should live and behave was definitely a head scratcher and amazing to talk to these people, right? Like that is some of the most fun when you agree, when you're hopefully you're talking to someone who's not a nasty person who's coming after you for the wrong reasons or whatever. But if you're talking to someone who's generally a good person, interested in discourse about subjects that you disagree about, or you don't even know that you could disagree about some of these things, that makes for some of the best, most life changing conversations. And I'm afraid that a lot of people aren't having these now, because as soon as you reach something that's a little bit taboo or a little bit outside of the norm, you're not allowed to talk about that anymore, especially not on campus, right?
Especially not on campus. Not, in fact, not only are you not allowed to talk about it on campus, if you're a professor, you're not going to get tenured. If you're a student, you're not going to have people that are, pouring into you. Um, if you're part of a religion, your friends aren't going to talk to you anymore, and you got to go leave because now you're a heretic. If you're part of the, medical system, now you're this again. You're a heretic, and you got to leave. We have just set these things up, and again, what does that do? It kills, not just doesn't just kill conversation, it kills curiosity, because we're no longer accepting that that's how we're supposed to be. We don't tap it. It's that factory setting, and we're like, gosh, it's too dangerous to be curious. It's too dangerous to ask questions. Not only have been habitually dragged out of it, now I'm scared to even try it, because I'm going to lose my relationships. I'm going to lose family and friends over this. It's not worth it, man. I'll just nod my head and go along with the flow.
Right. Same thing with comedy. Same thing with kind of developing wit. If you don't get to exercise that muscle or build that muscle, then blah. You miss that chance, kind of, right?
You very much do, man. You very much do. Yeah, that's 100%. And I've got, a couple friends. And Brian Callen is a friend, and Brendan Schaub is a friend, and that whole comedy scene has been interesting, man, and what they're having to navigate with what's being allowed and what's not being allowed, and again, allowed being in air quotes. But it's just a weird time society. But I think everybody's being impacted by this.
Yeah, we all are. I mean, even music. If the music strays into taboo territory, then like can't do it. You can generate all sorts of AI crap that could be affecting you subliminally. Like who knows what's going on there? But you can't talk about this, and you can't sing about that, and that crushes so much of that curiosity that you were talking about, and it also disincentivizes any sort of originality or original thinking, especially coming from young people, right?
That's it, man. And that's why I call school a religion. The word religion, and I'm not knocking people's spiritual pursuit. So people, again, definition of terms, Socrates says beginning of wisdom is definition of terms. When you say education, people automatically think school. I go, no. The way I define those, they're inherently different. They're actually diametrically opposed. But I say religion, and I'm not a fan of religion. People are like, oh, you don't believe in God, or you don't find spirit, you don't believe people should look for a spiritual truth. That is not what I'm saying at all. But religion is based on the word religare, which is to bind, to put chains around. That's why I say school is this religion that has nothing to do with education. Education, educare, means to draw out. You're drawing out the uniqueness in that individual. Whereas religare, religion, means you're binding that human. And I think that's what school does. They bind you there, and they go, no, you will stay right here until you believe all the things we believe, whether you actually believe them or not.
Now, one other piece that I love that you talk about so much is the physical education aspect of all of this. And I don't know what it was like when you were coming up, or a lot of the listeners, but I know that there was this idea of the anyone who kind of focused on sports, fitness, getting strong, getting fast, and caring about that. Was dumb, was a jock, was, like this zero sum game where, like, if you focus on being good at a sport, you are dumber than someone who did something else for some reason. What is that about, and how do we correct that?
Yeah, it's so stereotypical, man. I mean, the reality is you're going to be in your physical body. We talk about meta skills, and on our campuses and our programs, we're talking about meta skills. There's very few meta skills, I believe, and that is do every what does every person need? That's a hard thing, because you and I have very different lives. Do you have, I've got electric fencing out here, and if a tree falls down, I need to have the skill of lumberjacking a tree and splicing electric fence. I didn't need that skill 2.5 years ago. I need it now. You may not need it. So that's not a meta skill, because our lives are different. We're going different, and that's great. But there's meta skills where everybody needs these. I think the ability to create relationships, have civil discourse, communication, I would argue that's a meta skill. Another meta skill is the fact that you're going to be in your body until you're 6 feet under. So, shouldn't we understand how to make that the best possible experience? Shouldn't we understand how to keep that body healthy? It's not about just being jacked and having a six pack and cool, man. That's great. I'm 44 and you can still see my abs. That's awesome. I'm proud of that. I do work for that. That's great. More importantly, I don't get sick. I haven't had a cold in like 10 years, right? And so I can show up every day and have energy and feel good and be the best possible version of myself to pour into others, to take care of my family. Like, that's important. These are the meta skills. So the whole concept of, I don't know enough to go, how did we get so far where we started equating people in good shape with, idiocracy? Like, I don't know
Fascism?
how we.
Like,
Yes, it's so odd because how we can name so many people who are not in good shape and are dumb as a doornail. I mean, you can find those people, and we can name my business partner. I mean, if people know who Tim Kennedy is, the man's a unicorn of a physical specimen. I promise you, I've done enough working out with Tim to know something's off there. Like, he's a special breed. And hey, look, maybe something's off mentally there too sometimes. But I'll tell you this: Tim is one of the most intelligent humans I've ever met, and I know a lot of people. He's one of the most intelligent humans ever, as well as a physical specimen. And I can go down a laundry list of humans that's the case. So I don't know how we got to where we put those two things at odds with each other. What I do know is that you're going to be in your body forever, and your physiology matters. And when we're talking about raising a generation of young people who are always going to be in their bodies, one of the things we're focusing on so much from a cultural perspective is mental health, but we're treating it as if it's something that it's like, do I have mental health? Is it in my pocket? Is it in my backpack? Do I have it? Like, do I not have it? Right? We're treating it as this thing you have or you don't, beating the kids over the head with it. Like, mental health is an issue, mental health, mental health. And they're like, I guess, shoot, do I have this? Like, I'm scared of this mental health boogeyman, versus talking about the fact that being mentally healthy is a byproduct of a number of things, but one of them is being physically healthy. When your physiology is solid, right? And that means the food you're putting in your body, it means the things you aren't putting in your body, it means being active and movement, it means understanding that this iPhone device or video, those are dopamine draining machines. So your body's only going to be able to handle so much of draining that dopamine before it's going to need to refill it and recharge. Otherwise, it's drained and you're actually physiologically depressed to go out and try to do something. Like, until they understand the physiology behind that, they're at a disadvantage. So that's why for us, it's like, no, let's dive into what human health looks like, because so many of these other byproducts, your mental health being one of those things, your joy, your peace, like, they're partially dependent upon that.
yeah, and a piece of the mental health thing too. It was talked about a little bit when I was coming up, but not anything like it is
Not
now.
incessantly like it is now,
Right,
right?
where it's
Yeah.
like you said, a boogeyman and something that you're supposed to keep or have all the time, and for me, I do take issue with that because whether we're talking about when I was, uh, a teenager bummed out, which made me want to play guitar more for hours or just write something that was like a gnarly song or a piece of poetry to get it out and work through it so that then I could rise above it, overcome it. It's supposed to be this thing that you never feel bummed out now, right? Like, and if you do, you have to talk about it, and that becomes who you are, and you have to be medicated, or it's
And that's it, right? And it's a methamphetamine deficiency of some sort. And so we've got
right.
to get, yeah, right. It's like, gosh, man. Yeah. I so agree with that. I had a gentleman come on the show in March. And he is a behavioral psychologist, and he works with families, and he works with a lot of young people. And he works with them. A lot of young people come into him saying, look, we have mental health issues. So the first things he does, he says he brings in the family, and he says, hey, give me a background. What's going on? What's happening? What's going on with the physiology? Are they getting exercise? Are they getting some sunlight? Are they getting real food? Like, what does that all look like? Tell me about that first. And then they go, okay, cool. And then, are you getting out of the way? Are you over parenting? Or are you controlling every little bit, right? So that you're stunting their emotional growth. Let's get you out of the way too. And then he operates on what he calls behavioral therapy and responsibility therapy. He prescribes responsibility for the young people. He prescribes walking and exercise and taking on something without your parents there. And, just kind of the way kids used to grow up in a lot of ways. And he's like, it's a horrible business model because I get them to realize they don't need me. But it's the right thing. It's the right thing to do.
And it's important to recognize as well, and it may seem obvious that this is one of the quotes. Speaking about kids and how to raise them and teach them that sort of thing. Do what you want them to do. Be the person you want them to be. And then as you're working on that and as they're working on that and failing at it, you just keep encouraging that failure and you bring them along while you keep being a better version of yourself. And how many adults are actually seeing education of their kids that way these days outside of your programs? Probably approaching zero, it seems.
Very few, right? There's this prevailing thought of like, I'm not qualified. It's one of the things I hear most. Well, you raised them for the first 5 years. You didn't send them anywhere. They walk, they talk, they speak English. Why? Because they were around you while you did it. You encouraged those failures and you kept going. Like that's it. It's that simple. Really is that simple. Not saying that it's easy. I'm just saying it's that simple. And that's really a microcosm for everything else. They do what you do before they do what you say. So, who are you? What's the example? How are you moving forward? And what are you making normal in your house? Speaking English is normal in your house, so your kids speak English. Like, that's not complicated. You don't have to directly instruct, okay, oh, okay, honey, but what you just said was a noun. Like, no, nobody gives up. That doesn't happen. Like, that's it. So in our house, what's normal? Well, we got chores that everybody goes out and does in the morning. Like, that's normal. We got the food that we eat, and we talk about why we eat a certain way and why we, really don't introduce other things. Mom and dad go get outside. Mom and dad grab books. We read to them. We make reading exciting. My kids, write books and read books incessantly. Like, that's what they do for fun is they read a lot. And we're physically active and physically fit, and I still train in martial arts. And so my son's kickboxing and he's wrestling and it's just what we've made normal. It's not difficult.
And what about, kids writing books as opposed to writing essays or a one pager or a paragraph or whatever? What is the difference? How do you encourage or let, I should say, a kid come to that as opposed to just like these really boring projects that they get once a week and they have to bring home with them, that sort of thing?
I don't start with the boring projects. Like, that's what kills the love of wanting to do these things anyways, right? Because we got to think about what's your writing before. Writing has a number of uses that are great. Writing can be very therapeutic. It can get the chaos out of our minds and allow us to bring it objectively, into paper so that we can disassociate with it and we can work through some things. That's why when you got bummed out as a teenager, you writing a song and writing these poems, you said it helps you overcome those things, right? You're taking that chaos out of your brain and you're able to look at it now and objectify it and go, okay, how do I want to behave with this? How do I want to interact with this? How much of this is just a story or how much of this is truth, right? You didn't maybe consciously do that, but that's what you were doing is you're wrestling with that. So writing has that use, or writing is getting a message across somehow. So writing an email back and forth or writing a text message or we very rarely outside academia write an essay for essay's sake. But what do we do very early? Before kids understand what writing is for and before they're really fundamentally ready from a brain development standpoint, we hammer home writing the sentences and writing the essays and understanding verbs and adverbs and adjectives. Man, we drove from California out here to North Carolina, and my kids had those Mad Libs, right? And now I am a decent communicator. I will say I'm better than most at writing. I can write well. I can communicate well. I didn't know how to. They're like, Dad, give us a adverb. I'm like, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. I got my straight A's already years ago, but I don't know what I memorized it. I don't know what that is, man. Help me out. All right. So we break all of these things down before they've got any sort of experience, and we kill the love of it. If they just see that you're reading and you're excited about things and that you're writing and it's like, I'm just journaling today a little bit. I saw this quote and I really like that. it becomes something that they find the therapy in that without us having to force it. We're creative beings. We have something to produce. It doesn't mean every kid's going to want to write or be a writer, especially at the same age, but they won't have that opposition to it.
What about the concept of just in case versus just in time?
Mm, man, everybody's got to learn trigonometry just in case, right?
Use it all the time.
Just in case you need it, right? Just in case. Everybody's got to learn chemistry just in case you need it. School is built on the just in case model. It is you've got these specific subjects, these specific concepts. They're going to be taught in a specific way, and you're going to regurgitate the information in a specific way, just in case. Versus this is who you are and this is what you want to do. Well, let's figure out now how to acquire that skill and integrate it. We have this fear that we're going to need this skill and we won't take the time to go after it or to go get it, to learn it, because we're not going to be able. But then we also try to combat that by deciding those skills are going to be inherently in these specific subjects. It's just provably ridiculous all the way around. That's the concept. Now, do some people need trigonometry? You bet. You bet. But if you've taught them to be curious, if they have self-awareness, they have self-confidence, they're going to find out, like, you're not going to be able to stop them from acquiring those skills in trigonometry, and they'll do it really, really quickly, right? I've had 11-year-olds on campus that are smoking trig and calculus, smoking it, like killing it, because that's where they were, and that's where they wanted to go. That's where their mind was. That's what they wanted to do. I couldn't stop them if I wanted to. So it's like, cool, man, go get it. And they've gone down those like kind of engineering and programming, and cool, sounds good. And then I've got other, young kids who like that, like they're not going to go past much more like algebra, maybe over anything else at all. And they're like, man, I am done with this, but they can run a P&L like nobody's business. And it's making six figures in high school. Like, but so that's the concept, man. It's the just in case versus just in time means you have the ability and, more importantly, the awareness and the bravery to go after acquiring the skills when you need to acquire them.
It's amazing too when you start this really early. And this happens in music all the time, where a lot of people, they'll start playing guitar or something at 14, 15, 18 years old. And you can become great doing that. You can become an incredible. And a lot of the most famous people known for playing guitar, for example, did learn at that age. But the people who are true prodigies operating at this just exceptional level of human performance, a lot of times they started when they were 3 or 4 or 8 years old. So by the time they're 18, they've already been operating at a professional level for a decade. They're 18 years old and they've been a pro for a decade. And that's what you're talking about with trigonometry or running a business. And if you follow that trend line throughout the rest of their lives, if you can make 100 grand in high school, what happens 10 years later or 50 years later? What have you done with your life? What have you accomplished compared to someone who is just sitting in a chair?
That's the reverse, right? Somebody that's just sitting there saying, okay, my the habits I'm building are sitting here listening to somebody else tell me who I am and what I need to do and when I need to do it. And then the next year, somebody else is telling me who I am, what I need to do, when I need to do it. And you do that for 12 years. And then maybe you take out some loans to go do it for another 4 or 5. That is a hard habit to break, man. It's a hard habit to break. And again, it's just paying attention. I want to pay attention to my kids so much. I'm not going to knock it out. There's no such thing as perfect parenting. I'm not going to see everything. They're still going to develop other skills and loves and desires later on, but I want to pay attention to them so much that I have an idea of what they're thinking, and that I can see the things that they gravitate to before they even realize they're gravitating towards it, right? Like, I want to just watch that. I could see that my oldest daughter wanted the horse thing so much. She was like, okay, let's expose her to it. And then my middle daughter wanted to buy those horses too. And so she's like, here we go. And she did like it, but man, it wasn't the thing that she couldn't stop doing. She couldn't stop herself all day long from cartwheels and flip. So she's a competitive gymnast right now. I'm not surprised, right? My son is the stereotypical, like, I'm going to go climb this tree. I'm going to go fight this warrior. I'm going to make a weapon out of freaking everything. I'm going to make cool, man. Kickboxing and wrestling, dude, he'll do it 7 days a week. He's 8 years old. And he's like, Dad, I need to up my push-ups in the shower to 70. I'm like, wait, you do push-ups in the shower? He's like, yeah, every day. I do push-ups in the shower. I was just doing 20 for a long time, but that's so easy. I'm like, you still go, like you go to kickboxing and wrestling like multiple days a week. And he's like, yeah, I know, but like while I'm at home for my training, like I need to up those to 70 in the shower. I'm like, cool, man, go get it, you little savage. Like, have that. Right. And I just want to pay attention to those things and foster those things as much as I can, because you're right. They'll show those signs so early. I had a friend, I have a group of friends who are a pretty well-known band at this time. And I grew up with these guys and graduated high school with these guys. And there's one in particular. I remember when we were young, we were just getting into junior high school, and music was his, it had always been his thing. It had never been I love to listen to it, but I had never had any desire to learn an instrument, try. I picked up a couple things and I'm like, this just doesn't make sense to me. I'm not interested at all. Right. For him, it was like, oh no, this makes sense. And I just can get lost in this. And I was sitting at a party in junior high school and he's like, I think I'm going to just start a band at some point or join a band. You want to join a band? Do you want to start a band? And I'm like, I have no desire, man. But he's like, we're sitting there listening and Too Short came on, right? So this tells you how old I am. So, and he's like, oh, okay. And it's going, bow, 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 right? This whole thing, he's like, ooh, okay. And he just grabs and he just starts playing it. And I'm like, dude, that's awesome. He's like, I've never heard this before, but he could just do it. Thank God his parents didn't go, oh, no, put that guitar down. You need to go do trigonometry. Like, thank God. Because now, I mean, he's made an amazing career out of that. And I think that's freaking fantastic.
Yeah.
We can do that for all of our kids, man.
And the world gets to benefit from that.
The world
Everyone
benefits.
does, right?
That's right. That's exactly right. Everybody wins because of that.
Yeah. Well, in just the few minutes that we have left, I would love for you to speak about. We've talked about kind of like how it's important to nurture those individual passions and the overall individuality of children, but also it's important that they live, at least in your programs, by some sort of code. And you look around at society, that is not the way that most people are living in the modern age. So, what is the value of that, and what does that look like?
That is, I appreciate that question. That is where we find our tribe. So it is not we talked about this earlier. We don't think everybody should believe the same things other people believe. It's okay to believe something different from somebody else. Just understand why you believe what you believe. And our role as the educators is to push back. It doesn't matter if we agree with your belief or not. Our goal is to make you think about the things that you believe. But where we all come together is this code of ethics. I don't need to agree with you on where that comes from. Whether you think that is something that is inherently ingrained in our DNA, whether you think it was by design, whether you think it comes because of culture, like that's great. We can talk about all those conversations. But what we're going to agree on is a general consensus of let's treat other people the right way. Let's have integrity. Let's be honest, about who we are. And that's what we're asking people to agree upon is that can we share those same values of honor and bravery and integrity? And hey, by the way, let's get into the definition of what that means. When they start any of our programs, we define those. What does it mean to live by a code? Here's our code, and let's define what those mean. What does that mean to you? Do you think it's important to be honest? You think it's important, to be polite, to be brave. And if you don't agree with this code, it's okay. We just may not be the same kind of people. I don't need you to agree. But we just, we feel very strongly that people should be good humans. And this is a general way to describe what a good human could potentially look like. What do you think? So we always just start there, man.
Yeah. I love that. Well, Matt, so much fun to talk to you. We could keep going all day, I'm sure. But what is the best place for people to find Apogee Strong and all your books and everything that you're working on?
Thanks, man. ApogeeStrong.com, best place to go. We got a little documentary that's in there. You can find our campuses. You can find all the various verticals, the various programs. So ApogeeStrong.com. We're pretty active on Instagram at Apogee Program. That's a good place to go to. So those are the best places to start. That'll link you to all the programs, the foundations, where we're trying to make this accessible to everybody, the payment processing, so everything we're doing to try to make this accessible to humans can all be found there.
I love it. Matt, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Honored, brother. Thank you.
Hey, Abel here one more time. And if you believe in our mission to create a world where health is the norm, not sickness, here are a few things you can do to help keep this show coming your way. Click like, subscribe, and leave a quick review wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts. You can also subscribe to my new Substack channel for an ad-free version of this show in video and audio. That's at abeljames.substack.com. You can also find me on Twitter or X, YouTube, as well as Fountain FM, where you can leave a little crypto in the tip jar. And if you can think of someone you care about who might learn from or enjoy this show, please take a quick moment to share it with them. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.